Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on the topic of access to justice and funding, legal aid. In this video tutorial we'll be looking at what legal aid is, why it's important, and looking at an overview of the cuts that have happened in recent years thanks to LASPO 2012. In this video we're going to see that legal aid is state-funded legal help for those people who cannot afford legal advice or legal representation in court. And you can see on this slide here that legal aid is really important. It relates closely to Magna Carta Clause 40, which states that to no man will we sell or deny or delay right or justice. And Clause 40 is expressing equal access to justice and equality of arms before the courts. And under Article 6.1 of the European Convention of Human Rights, everyone has the general right to a fair hearing in the determination of civil rights and obligations to any criminal charge. And this implies an appropriate degree of equality of arms. Equality of arms in this context is really relating to the fact that if a person is being prosecuted or a person's being sued and they don't have financial means to defend themselves or put their case forward adequately, then they're not going to receive a fair trial. And an example we could look at here is known as McLibel. It's a famous case. It's the longest case in legal history. And this was where McDonald's was suing two individuals for libelous leaflets about McDonald's. But what's important from our perspective today is that in 2005, the European Court of Human Rights said that the lack of legal aid denied these two individuals the right to a fair trial. In other words, when you think about it, it's like a David and Goliath situation. McDonald's has so much money and so many legal experts on board. How can these two individuals with limited financial means possibly respond in a similar way? They don't have equality of arms. So legal aid can be important in achieving a fair trial. So as we've already said, legal aid is state-funded legal help for people who can't otherwise afford legal services. And we talk about there being an unmet need for legal services in this country, and that really just means that a person has a problem which could possibly be resolved by going to court, but that person's not able to get the help that he or she needs from the system. And there are actually lots of reasons why there's an unmet need for legal services. It might not just be a financial issue. A person may fail to see that their problem actually has legal implications. They might not be aware of their rights at all. Linking to that second point there, they're not aware of the law. They might not have the money to get that advice. So they might think that perhaps they need assistance, but they don't have the money to pursue that. They might not have the time to attend a solicitor's office if they've got difficult working hours or several jobs. They might not have the time to go and see a solicitor to access that help. And also they might just be scared of the legal system. It is very daunting, very intimidating for people. So there are lots of complicated reasons why people might not have access to justice. So we need to have some form of state-funded scheme to help assist people to ensure that their rights are being upheld. And as I've already mentioned, legal aid is really, really important. We looked at Magna Carta Clause 40, and I've already mentioned Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. But what we've got here is that having access to justice is part of the bedrock of human rights. It's also part of the rule of law, as advocated by Dicey. And when you think about criminal cases, a person's liberty might be at risk. They might potentially be going to prison for life, possibly. So it's really important that they have the opportunity to defend themselves. And the idea is that all people should be equal before the law. Again, coming back to this idea of equality of arms, that justice should be blind. and that you shouldn't have less justice because you can't afford the best barristers and the best lawyers. But in the reality, people don't have equal access to the law, and that's where we really need legal aid. Topic, you need to have a bit of awareness of the history of legal aid. So I'm just going to outline that for you now. Before 1900, legal aid to those who couldn't afford a lawyer only came in the form of charitable donations. And obviously that meant that lots of people were not able to access justice. So after World War II, more thought was given to forming a fairer society, and a welfare system was created and introduced. And we introduced Social Security, the NHS, and under the Legal Advice and Assistance Act, legal aid was first established, as you can see here, in 1949. And this new system acknowledged that equality of access and the right to representation before the law was fundamental to a just society. Legal aid expanded in the 1960s, and in 1984, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act provided duty schemes for people to get free advice in police stations. But as this legal aid system was growing, people were becoming increasingly concerned about the cost of legal aid. And so legal aid became increasingly available only to those who had the lowest income level. And the next big change to the system was when we had the 1999 Access to Justice Act passed. And this act was designed to redraw the whole system of legal aid and regulating legal aid to support a system which had grown so much since it was initially created. And this act created the Legal Services Commission, which administered the Community Legal Services for civil legal aid and the Criminal Defence Service for criminal cases. And then in 2011, we had Lord Jackson, who was reviewing civil litigation, and he recommended that even despite all the changes we'd already made, more changes needed to be made. He was primarily concerned with the cost of the system. And then we had LASPO, the Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act 2012. And this act sought to cut legal aid, and it sought to cut it by a huge amount. So the aim of LASPO was to cut the £2 billion annual legal aid bill in England and Wales by £350 million a year. We're going to see that this act has completely removed funding for certain areas of civil law, including private, family law and personal injury. So LASPO came into force in April 2013, and it created the publicly funded legal aid system that we're using today. And as I've already said, it dramatically reduced the availability of civil legal aid, and criminal legal aid is also being reduced. The aim of the Act was to help those most in need whilst cutting the budget by £350 million. But as I've already said, that was mainly in the areas of family, immigration, welfare benefits, employment and clinical negligence. Lots of people, including organisations such as the Law Society, have opposed this legislation. The system under LASPO is overseen now by the Legal Aid Agency, which has replaced the Legal Services Commission, and it's an executive agency sponsored by the Ministry of Justice. And we can see here the impact that LASPO has had. So in 1950, civil legal aid was available to 80% of the population. By 73, this has dropped by 40%. And today, because of LASPO, 70% of the population has no entitlement to civil legal aid. This slide here shows you cases that you can no longer get help for, and the cases that you can still get help for in terms of the civil courts. So the fact that you can't get legal aid for medical negligence is quite shocking. And you can see here a lot of these issues, immigration, housing cases. This is likely to be affecting the most vulnerable people. These are the types of cases that people are potentially going to need legal aid. So that's worrying. You've got lots of detail in your booklet about the criteria that you have to meet if you're in one of the maintained areas. So, for example, if you fall into a retained civil case, you're still not going to get legal aid automatically. You are going to have to pass the means test, which looks at the finances, and the merits test, looking at the merits of the case. In terms of criminal legal aid, the Legal Aid Agency funds directly the provision of criminal legal services, and we do still have free legal advice at the police station and help with representation at court if you fall within the tests that apply. So in criminal cases, everybody gets help at the police station through the PDS or the Public Defender Service. And this is a department of the Legal Aid Agency, and it ensures that people suspected or accused of a crime do have access to advice as they require it. And there is no means test, and this is free to everybody. And of course, the reason we're providing this free service for criminal legal aid as opposed to civil is, of course, that with criminal, we are potentially affecting a person's liberty. They might be getting a sentence of imprisonment, whereas in civil cases, the sanction's usually damages. So while civil cases are important, it's not going to impact on individual liberty in the same way. Following LASPO, people can still get legal aid help for representation in the Magistrates' Court as long as they are able to pass the means test so that their income falls within set figures, and also the interest of justice test, which falls under the merits test. In terms of representation in the Crown Court, legal aid is available for representation, but the defendant's household disposable income must be under £37,000, and our defendant might still be liable for contributions towards the cost. So I've provided some articles for you on SOLA, which look at the impact of LASPO, which I urge you to read and highlight, but I've pulled out some of the key aspects of LASPO for you here on this slide. So LASPO's had a huge impact and introduced lots of things that are making access to justice more difficult. So, for example, there's now fixed fees to try and reduce the use of experts in court. There's much more complicated paperwork, delays in getting to court. People are now being forced to represent themselves because their civil case is no longer covered, or they're not falling within the means and the merits tests. And children, migrants, vulnerable people are being particularly adversely affected by the new system. There's also a growing reluctance of solicitors and barristers to take on complicated or low-value cases because there's just not the funding for it. And this sort of depressing figure of only 4% of lawyers are now interested in going into legal aid, which is essentially helping the most vulnerable people in society. Because legal aid has been cut so dramatically by LASPO, this topic also requires you to know what alternative options there are. So if a person can't get legal aid, what are their other options? So you need to know about legal advice and law centres, pro bono work. CFAs are particularly important for this topic, legal expenses, insurance, and also trade unions. So you've got lots of information in your booklet and on your PowerPoints that I've provided on these. And I'll also put some additional reading on SOLA, particularly on CFAs, no win, no fee agreements, because you might well get asked a question in the exam on whether CFAs in particular are a good alternative to legal aid.